Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Kelsey. I'm the events coordinator at Tombolo Books, and we're just so happy to have everyone here. And we are especially thankful to have Denise Kiernan and Gilbert King here with us tonight as we celebrate Denise's wonderful new book, We Gather Together. And we get to hear from two incredible authors. So it's an honor to be in the same virtual space as both of you. And we appreciate you being here with us at Tombolo. And just a little bit about the store. If you're not familiar with us, we're located in the Grand Central District of St. Petersburg. And we are currently open for appointment shopping. And we recently just opened up for walk-ins as well. So if you're in the area, please come by, check us out. And if you are not in the St. Pete area, we would love to ship you books because we ship all over the country and we do our curbside pickup and everything. So we're happy to connect with you in any way that we can. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our moderator this evening, the award-winning author Gilbert King, author of three books, most recently Beneath a Ruthless Sun. His previous book, Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and The Dawn of New America was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2013. A New York Times bestseller, the book was also named runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Nonfiction and was a finalist for both the I'm going to mess this name up so horribly, so correct me if I don't pronounce it right, Gilbert, Chakatawata Prize?
Chautauqua. We were very close.
Okay. And the Edgar Award. King has written about race, civil rights, and the death penalty for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and he is a contributor to the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization covering the U.S. criminal justice system. King's earlier book, The Execution of Willie Francis, was published in 2008. He is currently a fellow at the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, and he lives in Brooklyn, New York. So Gilbert, thank you for being here, and I will let you take it away and introduce our Lady of the Hour, Miss Denise Kiernan.
Thanks, Kelsey. That was great. Thank you, and it's great to be back in a virtual space with Tombolo Books because it's my favorite bookstore in all of Florida, and it's absolutely beautiful. If you haven't gotten a chance to see it yet, it's phenomenal. In beautiful St. Pete, I highly recommend taking a walk in there if you're nearby. I'm going to start out by introducing Denise Kiernan, who is just a lovely person. Aside from all her talents as a writer, she's a great person who's a lot of fun and just never ceases to be uninteresting. So I'm going to say Denise Kiernan is an author, journalist, and producer. Her last two books, The Last Castle and The Girls of Atomic City, were instant New York Times bestsellers in both hardcover and paperback. The Last Castle was a Wall Street Journal bestseller, a finalist for the 2018 Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award, and a finalist for the Southern Book Prize. The Girls of Atomic City was a Los Angeles Times and NPR bestseller, named one of Amazon's top 100 best books of 2013, and has been published in multiple languages. Kiernan has been a featured guest on many radio and television shows, including NPR's Weekend Edition, PBS NewsHour, MSNBC's Morning Joe, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Denise, you were on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart?
I was. It's the most nervous I've ever been in my entire life, but it was awesome.
I'll bet he loved you. You guys must, I got to go look for that on YouTube now. It must be.
It's on my, are you kidding? It's on my website. It's like I want everybody to know. Yes.
And what is that website now that you mentioned it?
Yeah.
DeniseKiernan.com?
DeniseKiernan.com. Yeah. Yep.
Well, I have a lot of questions I'm going to ask you. I'm going to start out with talking about We Gathered Together. I'm also going to ask you some process questions because those are the ones I love, especially to pick the brains of another writer and just find out technique and you know how you do it. And then there's a Q&A function at the very bottom of your screen, not for you, Denise, but if you have any questions while I'm speaking and saying, you know, that was almost a good question, but here's a better one. Feel free to drop it in the Q&A and I will look to that and I'll bring those up towards the end. But I think we'll start out with some of my questions. First of all, did you ever think while writing We Gather Together that this book would be so timely given that we're in the midst of a global pandemic and Thanksgiving has become such a hot button issue this year. Can you just talk about that?
Oh my gosh. So as writers, we all know, as writers, we know this, and sometimes I don't necessarily know that readers understand that books are in our lives for a very long time. So you get an idea for a book, but you're not quite sure you want to write that book. So you create a file for that book. Then you decide to pitch it. And then that pitch gets tweaked, and then the editor accepts it, but then that gets revised, and then you write it, and then it gets edited, and then it gets edited again and revised again, and then it goes into production. So basically, you know, after you've done this for a while, that the world in which you conceive and write a book is very different than the world in which that book is going to land. But oh my God, I had no idea how much the world was going to change between the time I had written We Gather Together and We Gather Together landed on bookshelves. And I just kept saying, well, when we were going through production and proofing and all of that stuff, I kept telling my editor, oh gosh, I need another run at the epilogue because this is crazy. And, you know, it was very weird to be proofreading and going into production on a book titled We Gather Together when suddenly this phrase social distancing was trending. I mean, it was so surreal. It was beyond anything I had experienced as a writer in the last more years than I want to admit. And I don't know. It's either great timing or bad. I don't know. It feels timely to me still, because I think the essence of the story and the book is about finding reasons to come together, and coming together doesn't necessarily mean physically coming together. It can mean a meeting of minds. It can mean a gratitude process, which is something I talk about in the book. It can mean sharing ideals, all those sorts of things. But oh my gosh, yeah, the world changed a lot between the time I was conceiving this book, writing this book, and now touring in this space with this book. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you didn't predict the pandemic, but in a way, though, you do write about 100 years ago, you had the Spanish flu. And so what did you find like the difference? I'm just really curious about this, the difference between the pandemic today and Thanksgiving versus 100 years ago.
You know, that was another part when I was going through and editing and proofreading the book that weighed much heavier on me. Yeah. Once 2020 kicked off. But, you know, so I talk about Thanksgiving in 1918 during the Spanish flu, right after World War I. And people were tired of being away from their loved ones. People were coming back from fighting. They had already experienced a lot of loss. There was a lot of stress. They didn't like the restrictions, and all the messaging from healthcare officials and civic leaders. That message was, please keep your distance. Please stay safe. A lot of public functions were canceled that would have normally happened. And, you know, people were just so hungry to spend time together. And one of the stories that I came across that was really interesting was this, you know, small town, I think it was in Ohio, where one smallish family dinner resulted in 27 severe cases of that flu. And then, you know, Santa Claus got the flu, you know, and he wasn't going to go to the Minneapolis, you know, shopping center or whatever. I mean, all of these things happened. And, you know, you can look back and see how frustrated everybody was, because there is that desire to spend time with the people you love and the people you miss. But you know, it was not a good idea to do so. And you can see, if you go back and look at the news stories, as I did, and I write about in the book, you can see the ramifications of deciding to say, oh, well, it's Thanksgiving, but you can't do that. The virus doesn't say, oh, well, it's Thanksgiving, you know? So I think there are lessons, you know, to be carried forward to today in that whole episode. But that was it was very poignant going back and looking at that in the editing process, for sure.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it. You know, before we go too deep into this, we have to talk about Sarah Josepha Hale, you know, widowed mother, no formal education, and yet she's this fascinating and complex woman at the heart of this story. How should we think about her today?
You know, it's when I thought about whether or not why I wanted to do this book, or whether I wanted to do this book, Sarah Josepha Hale was a key figure. I knew, I had come across her story years ago while I was working on another book. And, you know, I knew she, as you said, you know, widowed mother of 5 kids, didn't have the benefit of the kind of education we all you know, take for granted, became an incredibly influential editor in the 19th century, despite all of that. And campaigned for a National Day of Thanks. But I don't write biographies, really. I don't write traditional biographies. So I came across her story and I just thought, that is amazing. That's really interesting, but I'm not sure what to do with that. So I sort of put it aside in an idea file, as I do, I'm sure you do, these files you keep about things that kind of pique your curiosity. And then, you know, sometimes I get more interested in the intersection of events and characters as much or even more so than the events and the characters themselves. And it was so interesting to me that her life and her campaigns intersected with famous writers and presidents and governors and ambassadors and all of these people, and that those events, you know, were extremely monumental events in American history. But that still wasn't enough. So, you know, I started thinking about the concept of gratitude and what that means over time, and how that is just such a compelling human instinct, timeless concept, ageless concept, you know, has existed since humans have walked the earth. And then I started to put all of those things together. But Sarah Josepha Hale was, you know, is a key part of We Gather Together. She takes up I would say a good third of the book. And, you know, this was a woman who just was incredibly tenacious. She, you know, she loved to write. She wrote novels. She wrote poems. A little poem you might have heard of called Mary Had a Little Lamb. It was originally called Mary's Lamb, but, you know, we know it as Mary Had a Little Lamb, which apparently has become very popular. I hear the kids talking about it. And she, you know, she used her position as an influential editor at a ladies magazine to raise the voices of others. She raised the voices of other women. She raised the voices of a lot of authors who were not yet known then. She you know, showcased the voices of authors that a lot of us, you know, are household names. You know, early on in her career, while editing this magazine, she, you know, reviewed the work of a very young author and said his prose was boyish and it needed to develop, but he showed signs of genius and could possibly be no less a poet than Shelley. And then she gets a letter from her son, David, who's attending West Point with this author, and says, essentially, "Hi, Mom. I saw that article. I shared it with my classmate, Edgar Allan Poe." And this is the beginning of Sarah Josepha Hale's relationship with Edgar Allan Poe, this writer-editor relationship that went throughout his entire career. He's a household name and she's not. And and she published his very last piece, Malona Tauta. She published the Cask of Amontillado. And this cracks me up because I just imagine these women who read her ladies magazine, reading about dress patterns and how to set a table and how your children should exercise, and somebody being walled up in a crypt, and it's just, it's hilarious. And she was just, I was talking to somebody recently and they said, "Oh, so she's the Forrest Gump of the 19th century." And I said, "Yeah, she kind of is the Forrest Gump of the 19th century. Yes, indeed." And she had an obsession with Thanksgiving. Yeah.
Right. And actually, I'm just curious, like, we all know about her through these, intersecting with Lincoln, Douglas, Walt Whitman, but what about her as a writer that's caught your imagination? How would you describe her?
She diligent for sure. I mean, she grew up not getting to really go to school, but she was always thankful and wrote about the fact that she grew up in a house where books and reading were everything. And so she read a ton from the moment she could. Her parents made sure that happened. Her older brothers, one older brother was lost at sea. The other went to Dartmouth. When he would come home from school, he would share what he learned with her. When she got married, and it's very sad, she was widowed early into her marriage, but her husband, David, they would have study hour together at night from 8 to 10. And they would, talk about French, or they would talk about botany, or, books they'd read. And he encouraged her writing. And he said, "You should start trying to get these things published." Well, she started sending out poems and, short stories. Then in 1827, she published a novel, Northwood, which got enough attention to get her a position as an editor at a ladies magazine. And that's how her whole career launched. But then she just didn't stop. So while she's editing this magazine, she is writing her own works, writing things for children, creating anthologies of other women's works. She did this wonderful book called The Ladies Wreath, which was a collection of women's poems, writing books of recipes, writing housekeeping books, writing, continuing to writing histories of important women throughout the ages. And I'm looking at all of this stuff that she's done and looking into her, because it's like, oh, well, there's this Thanksgiving thing over here, but oh my gosh, look at all this stuff she wrote. And you just think, wow, what have I been doing with my time? Because I don't even know how. And she's raising, she's got kids to take care of while this was going on. She wasn't some sort of, uber wealthy, I'm editing a magazine as a hobby. She needed to earn a living. And she so often used that pulpit, used that position as an editor to amplify the voices of others. And I found that just so incredibly inspiring. And some of her early stuff, not great, but she put it out there. And all of us who have written for many, many years, part of it is you gotta put it out there. And there's a real, for me as a writer, especially when I think back, to my very, very, very early days, there's a real bravery to doing that, to just kind of putting your stuff out in the world. And I found that quite inspirational from her. Yeah.
This book, there's a cast of characters that runs through this book. I mean, it's like a who's who in 19th century America. And I mentioned Lincoln, Douglas, Whitman, but I'm just wondering if there's any stories through your research that popped out and surprised you, somebody who obviously dabbles in history a little yourself. Anything that really jumped out at you or surprised you that you really weren't expecting in the process?
That's a good question. The idea to me that Sarah Josepha Hale's campaign to create one day, a national day of thanks that would be the same day every year throughout America, and that intersected with Lincoln's presidency during the Civil War. That was very interesting to me. The idea of a day of thanks where people came together happening when everybody was so divided, just so at odds. That was really compelling to me. But what was also interesting to me were these little things that cropped up. One of the favorite things I came across was a Thanksgiving meal, and there were Thanksgivings had been around long before this country has been around. And there was a Massachusetts Thanksgiving in 1862, at which the idea for the Massachusetts 54th, the first all-Black regiment in the military, was conceived at a Thanksgiving dinner. The governor at this dinner, put forth this idea to raise a regiment of Black men to fight in the Civil War. That came about during a Thanksgiving dinner. That to me was really, really interesting. Sojourner Truth, walked around door to door to raise money in 1863 to be able to give troops a Thanksgiving dinner. There were all of these interesting moments that kind of centered around Thanksgiving that I found really quite moving. And some of the Thanksgivings during the Civil War, during World War I, during World War II, were some of the most moving stories that I came across, because it can be incredibly challenging to take a moment to sit back and say, yes, I'm thankful for X, Y, and Z, when the world seems to be falling apart around you. And even though I didn't know this was the world we were going to be in when I wrote the book, I think those are very interesting messages now. But yeah, some of those little Thanksgiving anecdotes, especially during the Civil War, really, really stuck with me and meant a lot.
Mm. And also, FDR plays an important role in how we observe Thanksgiving today. What did he have to do with this?
So Sarah Josepha Hale wanted the idea of Thanksgiving, which was kind of an ad hoc. The date would move. One state would, a governor in Massachusetts would proclaim their Thanksgiving on this day. Connecticut might be this day. New York might be this day. So there was not one singular American Thanksgiving Day. And she wanted that to be. So she writes these presidents, and Lincoln agrees and proclaims in 1863, the entire, country is going to have Thanksgiving on this day. But it still wasn't what she wanted. She wanted it to be the same day every year, but she wanted it to be law. And so even when Lincoln agreed with her and proclaimed Thanksgiving, and actually this year it's the same day as it was in 1863, November 26th. Right after, a week after the Gettysburg Address, a very, very difficult time, very trying time. And even though presidents year after year would, make a proclamation, this day in November is going to be Thanksgiving, and governors and other states, and all the states would follow suit, and it became tradition, but it wasn't law yet. And then, during FDR's terms as president, he was constantly being approached by various commercial interests. When Thanksgiving fell too late in November, they would say, well, this is making the shopping season too short. And originally, Thanksgiving had nothing to do with holiday shopping. But as the 19th century wore on and the 20th century took off, there were parades and there was shopping. And in 1933, there was a consortium of merchants across the country who said, listen, Mr. President, we would really love if you would actually change Thanksgiving so it was a little earlier so we would have a longer shopping season. And in 1933, he said no. And then in 1939, it was late again. Thanksgiving was going to be the last day in November. And they came at him again and said, please, we really want you to change this. And he actually considered putting it in the middle of the month, like in the middle of the week. And he agreed to move Thanksgiving back an entire week. And this turned everybody upside down, because even though Thanksgiving wasn't an established holiday yet, an established federal holiday, it had been the last Thursday in November for as long as anyone could remember. And calendar printers were just like apoplectic. They had already printed, what day Thanksgiving was going to be that year. There were football games that were getting upended, vacations, all of this sort of stuff. Half the country said we're going to do it the last Thursday. The other half said we're going to do the fourth Thursday. A couple states said we're doing both Thursdays. We're going to give people 2 holidays. But then, in 1941, 2 years later, right after Pearl Harbor, it became a congressionally enacted holiday. And that is when what Hale originally wanted, and she was writing about that in the 1800s. She said, it's great that all these presidents want to have Thanksgiving, but it really needs to be a law. This needs to be a law, or it'll always be changeable. And she never saw that. That didn't happen until 1941. And I think it's so interesting that, Thanksgiving as a national observance started in 1863 during the Civil War, and it was congressionally fixed during World War II, so that you have this day of thanks that is associated with times that are so incredibly trying and difficult. And I think that is one of the more important messages of Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting. And in fact, We Gather Together really provides us with a model for a whole new way to look at Thanksgiving. Can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, a lot of us, grew up with this story of, pilgrims and Native Americans having, a very joyful meal together, and they were friends and everything was great. And, for years now, we've known that is not the case. The idea of Thanksgiving has existed long. The word Thanksgiving predates all of that. The concept of ceremonies giving thanks predates all of that. Ceremonies surrounding Thanksgiving predate all of that. And even occurrences of Thanksgivings on this continent predate all of that. So the idea that there would be a first Thanksgiving just doesn't make sense. When Sarah Josepha Hale, was approaching all of these presidents trying to get Thanksgiving established, she never mentioned she never mentioned Pilgrim. She never mentioned any particular date that should be commemorated. That had nothing to do with her campaign. That had nothing to do and was not mentioned in Lincoln's original proclamation. And, I get into in the book how some of these stories sort of came to be. And, there's just no, what we gather together, I think does is provide actually a real kind of look at Thanksgivings and harvest festivals and ceremonies surrounding giving thanks going way back. These things have happened since, humans have walked the earth, and brings that tradition forward all the way through till the 21st, till present day, till the 21st century. And provides a true story. It provides stories of people from all walks who had different ceremonies surrounding giving thanks on this continent and others in other places in the world. And then looks at how that kind of morphed into the, pre-colonial, colonial, and eventually American concept of giving thanks, and how that has continued to evolve. But what's in my book actually happened, which is not, which is not true of, this story we were kind of given as kids. And, it's hard to give, we need to do a better job with 7 and 8-year-olds about what we tell them about why we give thanks. And the idea to me of a holiday based on gratitude is very powerful and very moving and timeless. I mean, people have done this forever, and it's not an American thing. It is a human thing. And it actually, from before the United States of America existed, up through Hale and Lincoln, this has, nothing to do with who was first. It's what it means. It's about giving thanks. It's about coming together. It is about taking a moment to have gratitude. And so what I've tried to do in this book is just put out the actual stories, the truth, things that actually did happen, and just sort of encourage people to look at the real history and find inspiration there to come back to what I would consider to be the essence of Thanksgiving, which is really just gratitude.
Hmm. It's interesting when listening to you talk about this and the history of it. I'm just wondering where do you see gratitude in the United States today, gathering together in the United States today? Do you think Sarah Josepha Hale would be content with our Thanksgivings today?
It's funny. I think about that a lot, actually. She was so, gosh, I wish I could writing about things that happened in the past. Great history is like time travel. You just feel like you've been transported to another time. And, I wish I could sit down with her and have a cup of tea and ask some questions. This was a woman who, campaigned for women's education and but didn't want to have anything to do with the suffrage movement. She was her own sort of like complicated person in her own way. I think the parades and football the football games, I think the first Yale football game was about 2 years before she died. I'm sure it probably didn't register on her radar. I think the parades and the shopping and the football might strike her as a little odd. I think the increased focus, and this increased in the late 19th century and still goes on today, on charity. We have Giving Tuesday now. There are a lot of charitable things that go on during the Thanksgiving holiday and throughout the holidays. I think she would appreciate that. It's so much of this was it was just an interesting way writing this to look at American culture and American history through this very specific lens of giving thanks and Thanksgiving. You know, I think she would like some of those developments. I think she would scratch her head at some others. You know, but her tenacity and her dedication to using her voice to help others, I think still resonates today. And I think she would appreciate people in trying times like the ones we're having now that are actually making an effort to help other people kind of get through difficult circumstances.
Really interesting. I wonder if she saw Black Friday coming. Never saw.
Oh
that.
my gosh, I know. No, it's the commercialization is. I really do think she would probably just shake her head at people busting down the door at 4 a.m. for a flat screen. But you know, it's. I mean, it's one of those. But okay, so that's a part of the evolution of the holiday. But that to me just says it can continue to evolve, and that's one of the things I want to get across. I hope I got across in the book is that this holiday has already, Thanksgiving was not an American creation, right? It has, the concept and the practice has been around long before we have. We have our interpretation of it. That interpretation has evolved. It can evolve again. And it can be evolved to be a reflection of the best part of who we are. It can evolve to showcase the best aspects of what it means to be humans in the 21st century, living in this time, sitting around a table because of a holiday that in its essence is about being grateful. And, we can decide to make this holiday, just showcase the best of who we are. And I think she would be on board with that because she essentially took something that was already kind of its own tradition and she helped it evolve. She took it from what it was and said, no, this needs to be codified. This needs to be national and American and one day a year, and we all come together. And so she was a part of that evolution. And I think we would be doing well to continue in her example and really make Thanksgiving more about, in a sense, take it forward by taking it back to its essence, to the gratitude part.
That was really well put. I want to ask you some process questions, and some of them I'm sure going to be related to the book as well, but I'm really interested. I mean, you're known for your meticulous research, and I'm just wondering if, obviously you found so many great surprises throughout this book, and you could definitely see the things that made you think, oh, I have to tell this story. I can see that. But I'm just wondering about the darker sides. Did you ever get to a moment just thinking I'm going to need this, or I can't do this story, or what your challenges were in trying to bring this story, onto the page?
With, so much of it is, so much of writing narrative nonfiction to me is not necessarily what you keep in, but what you leave out. And there are so many, and this has happened with every book I've done. There are all these little stories that you think, I really want to talk about this, but this would feel, I love the term shoehorned. I don't know if you ever use that, but if I try and put this story in here, I'm going to be just I'm going to be sticking it in there, and it's going to disrupt the flow of the narrative. And I had said before how much I like sort of the intersection of events and people and things that happen. And when you look at stories from that perspective, that's casting a pretty wide net. But you always have to kind of narrow down on, where's the character taking me? Where's the theme taking me? Where is this aspect of the story taking me? And, it's hard to not to me, it's what you can't include. And sometimes those things get put aside and they're going to end up maybe not the main crux of another book, but they'll be like a little part of another book. Some of it is, I don't know if you ever play this game, but with your brain, but I'm going to find this one thing. Like there's this one piece of information, there's this one factoid, there's this one document I know I want to come across and I know I'm going to find, and it's going to enable me to, write this thing the perfect way I want to write it. And you almost never find that thing. So you have to kind of write take the story in a different direction, which is often a more interesting direction, not always, but I mean, it's when you're dealing with fact and history, I mean, you're limited. There's always that letter you want to see. There's always that, I want, something that, I want a piece of, I want something, a letter, a note, a document where, Sarah Josepha Hale says, I walked into the White House today and had tea with President Lincoln, and here's what we talked about. I would love that. That doesn't exist. Or maybe it does, and I haven't seen it yet. And so you kind of get these desires and aims and just sort of like wish lists of pieces of information that you want, and they don't always come across. But for me, it's always the hardest thing is it's not what you write, it's what you don't write. It's not what you include, it's what you have to say, you know what, you can't, you're really interesting little piece of information and I admire you and I love you, but you can't be in my story right now. And those are the hardest parts, the putting things aside. That's the hardest part for me. I don't know, is that the hardest part for you? I think that's hard.
No, I just tend to put everything in there and let the editors deal with it later. Sometimes you just need to be told that, no, this doesn't work. And then, someone else told me.
I'm sticking it in anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I know. That's pretty funny. So I'm also curious about this, like, obviously you must have gone down several rabbit holes during the course of this research. And so I'm always wondering, like, do you get to a point where you're saying, okay, now I can start writing a draft, or do you just go back and forth? Research a little bit, write maybe a chapter. How do you do it?
Okay, there's an element of going back and forth for sure, but I always start with an outline. And it takes a while for me to decide I'm going to do a particular book and what the elements of that book are going to be. So like when I came across Sarah, Josepha Hale's story years ago, I thought that's really cool. I don't want to do a biography. Oh, the Civil War Thanksgiving thing. That's really interesting. I don't want to write a book about the Civil War. Oh, the gratitude piece. Oh, suddenly this feels like a book I could do. So then I have these three elements and I'm trying to put them together in some sort of story form. But then I have an outline. The outline might go right out the window once I start writing things, but it's there. And that to me, it's just a map. It's like, I want to get from here to here. Right now, I think I'm going to take this route. As I'm writing, I might need that sort of GPS, like rerouting, depending on what I find and what I come across. And that's okay. It's frustrating, but it's okay. It just sort of calms me to know I know at least one way to get to the end. So that's what I need. But then as you start to research things, I mean, I do a lot of mind mapping. I don't know if you're familiar with mind mapping, but you know, it's not outlining. It's like an idea and arrows, and this reminds me of this, and that reminds me of that, and that connects to this. And it's a very non-linear way of thinking of ideas and stories and concepts. And I do a lot of mind mapping. I get these giant whiteboards. I don't use sort of, you know, dry erase boards that you would get at, you know, an office store, because those are too tiny. I go to Lowe's or Home Depot, and I get literally, you can cut them to size. And I have ones that take up almost my entire living room floor. And you can, I will put timelines across one end, and then, you know, characters and themes. And I just look at how things connect to each other. And you know, I do that when I write. So as I'm writing, so I start with an outline, and then I start writing. Before I've decided to do a book, I've already done actually a fair amount of research, because if you're doing narrative nonfiction, you can't decide to do a book if you don't already know that there's not enough stuff there for you to draw upon. But then as you're doing it, you always come across so many other fun things. And, you know, the hard part is keep it in, put it out, keep it in, put it out. You know, and you use the outline as a guideline, and the outline grows and changes, and the mind map gets very messy. So for me, it is sort of a shifting of, at first, it's a lot of research and a skeletal outline, and then it becomes still research, but writing. Then it becomes mostly writing and maybe still a little research, and then almost all writing, but then I can't help looking into things that I can't let go. That's my problem. There are certain things like I'll just keep looking into, even though I should just not be researching anything anymore. So it's almost like a shifting. It goes from research and writing to research and writing to writing and research, and it shifts that way. It's very messy.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, for everybody. Also, people in the audience, feel free to jump in with the Q&A, and the Q&A
Oh, yeah.
on the screen. We have
Please.
some questions coming in already. I was just thinking, while you were talking about that outline going out the window, you ever go back and read your book proposal and look at that? They're totally different books usually. That's so funny. Oh, we have a good question from Candace right here. Hi, Denise. Can you share a story with us that you had to leave out of the book?
That I had to leave out of this particular book.
You could make up anything and just say, I didn't put it in the book.
I could just lie right now.
Yeah.
No, there were a couple of different stories that I came across that took place in sort of the, you know, late 20th century, about modern interpretations and celebrations of Thanksgiving that I thought might be interesting to include, but then I thought I had already come forward enough, and I didn't want to include those. And there were other, there were so many different ancient, I talk about ancient Rome, I talk about ancient Greece. I mean, there were so many very old world celebrations of Thanksgiving, harvest, gratitude, etc., that I could have just gone on and on and on and on about, but I just kind of wanted to give a flavor of those before I moved into not the present day, but what was the present day for Sarah Josepha Hale, which was the 19th century. So yeah, they're always with it's usually, extra stories about an area you've already kind of gone into. It's like, how much of that flavor do I give? I've given a little bit of that. Do I give more? Do I give less? So it's sort of like going deeper into any of those areas. That is always kind of tricky for me, for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. This is not a question, it's a comment, but I thought you should know it. It's from Big Frank in Southern California. And Big Frank says, Denise is the best author in the country today. That's all he says. So there you go.
Thank you, Big Frank. Thank you so much. That is awesome. That makes
Frank needs to be invited to.
That just puts a big smile on my face.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Another thing that I noticed about your writing, you have a way of writing that makes history sort of come alive. It really does, at the cliche, jump off the page, but you really do have a real knack for that. And I want to ask, aside from what's your secret, can you just look at historical documents and sources and just recognize the drama and take it from something dry and create a scene out of it? I'm just really curious about your process of creating these scenes.
Sometimes thank you very much. Sometimes it's random stuff like, essentially you're talking about world building, which is something that, a lot of sci-fi writers, fantasy writers talk about when they're creating their worlds in their books. But when we do it as nonfiction writers, we are restricted by fact and things that actually happened. Old papers, old documents are huge, old letters. Old newspapers and magazines are fantastic. When you look at what people were wearing, what they were paying for things, what was on the front page of a paper, like what was concerning to individuals, what they were angry about, happy about, what they were shopping for, what they were wearing, all of those sorts of things, I think create different layers of experience when you go into a book, where people lived, what their houses looked like, what their furniture was like, what their kids did, what their kids studied at school, what they ate, how they worshiped, what their social rituals were. A lot of that stuff you can glean from, there might be a letter that has no actual bearing on the topic that you're writing about, but they might write about something random like a tea that they hosted, and you get a flavor for what life was like then and there. Old maps. I love old maps. Oh my God, I love old maps. National Archives, Library of Congress. There's so many great places that have good old maps, old diaries, even diaries of people that have nothing or who are not in your book. But they are writing about living in that time. Those sorts of things, what people were concerned about, what mattered to people, and all of those different things that sort of, colored and shaped their lives. That sort of stuff is actually really fascinating to me. I love reading old newspapers. When I was doing, we gathered together and got into the early 20th century rather, when the parades first started to happen, and Gimbel's in Philadelphia, had, one of the first holiday parades. And I was looking at old Gimbel's ads for lingerie and coats and petticoats and things like that. And then they had like, bring your kid to Gimbel, have them ride on real ponies. And I looked at that ad and I thought, they had ponies in a department store? Who was cleaning up? Like, what was going on there? But then I thought, if I were a kid, I would love to go ride on a pony in a department store. That sounds fantastic to me. but just like what they were doing and promoting to try and get people, interested in their store and shopping in the holiday season and all of that sort of stuff. And yeah, I love the ads, and I use a lot of ads and promotions in the book that I saw, especially surrounding Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving celebrations, that I hope give a really interesting flavor about early Thanksgivings and how people participated. And because I find it fascinating. And as you know, if you're going to write a book, you had better find it fascinating, because it's going to be in your life for a long time, and you'd better be pretty interested in it. Yeah.
Totally true. People don't realize that.
Yeah.
This question is from Nancy Shivers. She says at the end of her question, she says, "Thank you. I found the book fascinating and learned a lot." But her question is, do you foresee a time when we will be able to separate the day from the fictionalized story of the Pilgrims and the Indians?
I hope so. I mean, I like, yeah, I do. I actually do. I am not, in We Gather Together, I present a different Thanksgiving story, an alternate Thanksgiving story that is true, and pertains to the evolution of American culture. I am not the first person by any stretch of the imagination to point out that the story we have been giving kids for years is not only not accurate, but also exploitive of the original occupants of this continent, and kind of disingenuous and doesn't really serve anyone well. But part of the challenge, I think, is that we give these stories to kids who are 7 or 8 who can't really, necessarily process them quite well, and then we don't revisit and give them the real story later in life. So I hope my book is a part of that, where we can separate that the fiction from the fact, and we can sort of get back to what Thanksgiving was conceived to be, before America was even conceived. But yeah, I do. I have to think that we're going to be able to move in that direction and make that take Thanksgiving back, in a sense, and get it back to where it needs to be, and the message of gratitude that originally infused so many ceremonies and traditions that predate the United States of America, and again, evolve our holiday, let it evolve again, and move away from legend and into fact, and back to the true spirit of gratitude. So yes, I think we can. I do think we can. We can all, if we all decide, we can talk to. I think a big part of that is actually schools. Is actually what we're telling kids. I think that's a big part of that. I think it's a big part of that.
Absolutely right. I think we have time for this one last question, but everybody must want to know this. Have you changed how you, this is from Jean or Jeannie, have you changed how you celebrate Thanksgiving in light of writing this book? Have you created new traditions as a result?
Oh my God, that's a great question. I haven't, but that's actually a great question. I will say that, no, it's not that I haven't. I love Thanksgiving, and actually the intro to this book is in first person, and I talk about some of the things that mean a lot to me regarding Thanksgiving, and how I want to feel good about Thanksgiving. I want to get back to the essence of Thanksgiving. There are certain things that will always be important to me. The foods. I'm a big cook, and I'm from an Italian Irish family, and cooking is everything to me, and having people to my house and giving them food. And so many of the foods we eat today during Thanksgiving actually do date back hundreds of years, for a variety of reasons. And I get into some of that in the book. But this year, so Thanksgiving's a big deal in my house. The actual day, we often have, if it's not family over, we have people who can't go home. You know, we have there's usually a ton of people in the house for Thanksgiving Day. And then Saturday after Thanksgiving is a big leftover party where I have a bunch of leftover food, and I make white bean turkey chili, and little turkey sliders, and all of this sorts of stuff. And we put the tree up, and people hang ornaments and stop by when they have a moment. None of that is happening this year because of everything that's going on, and we want to be safe. But because none of that physical interaction is happening this year, I have been a little bit more focused on sort of shifting from obligation to physical guests in my space to intention. So the intent to connect with people who mean something to me, people who might not, be feeling the spirit, people who, might be feeling a little lonely. So I'm trying to sort of think about, who do I intend to connect with? Because a lot of times I'm so busy with everything that's going on here during that weekend that I can't often connect with people who mean a lot to me. So I'm trying to shift to focusing on that this year. So that's how it's changing for me this year, that I'm going to eat the same stuff. I'm going to make my favorite cranberry sauce. I'm going to make my little stuffing muffins and all that sort of stuff. But I am going to actually kind of focus on connecting with folks that I might not usually connect with during Thanksgiving weekend, because normally I'm so busy hosting whatever's going on here. So that's how it's changed for me a little bit. Yeah.
Well, that was a great question, Nancy. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming. The book, highly recommend it. We gathered together, Denise Kiernan. I don't know what else to say, except it's such a pleasure seeing you. And even if it's
thank you,
not
Gilbert.
live.
No, thank you so much. I mean, it's, I feel really grateful that I'm allowed to bring this book out, but I also feel really grateful that you're doing this with me, that Tombolo is doing this, because this is just a very weird time for everyone. And this makes it feel a little, it just makes it feel a little better. And I really, really appreciate you, Gilbert, and Tombolo, and this whole, and everybody who tuned in tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That's very nice.
And we want to say thank you too again to both Gilbert and Denise for being here with us this evening. It was such a pleasure to listen to you talk about the book. There are still copies at Tombolo, so please pick up your copy. Yeah, and we have the signed book plates, so pick up your copies from Tombolo Books and read this magnificent book. And it's very timely, as we were just saying. So thank you again so much, Gilbert and Denise, for spending your time with us this evening. And I hope both of you have a very joyous and happy and safe Thanksgiving.
You too,
Thank
Kelsey.
you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.